So we move on, just on time to welcome here Managa Pillay from the National Department of Basic Education. I already saw your slides, so I'm a bit ahead of the crowd. Just be aware when you click, it will be a little delayed. It's just how it is. And here, this is what people will see, so you cannot move around. I know I'm struggling myself. Okay, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So Karen has set the bar high in terms of keeping time, so I'm going to get right into it because I have so many slides and I try to tell you everything. Okay, so just to set a context for everybody, we know that we have a population of about 60 million. I think the important statistic is that 13 of them are under the age of 30, and we actually have 14 million learners in the basic education system, which is a big number. We have about 26,000 schools and about 400 educators. I think the point that I wanted to make here is that schools are a microcosm of society, and with all the social ills that we have, you know, these vulnerabilities are felt within the school walls. So just a slide that gives you all the intersecting vulnerabilities, and as you can see, it's massive, you know, ranging from a whole lot of issues to hunger, poverty, the HIV issue, social security, trauma, grief, and I think, you know, many of us know it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And here, just to hone it in, to bring it down into the schooling system, and what then framed our comprehensive sexuality education piece. And you know, these were some of the focal issues that we tried to look at when we looked at CSE. This is a conceptual framework in which we frame a lot of the work. And I think this slide basically, as you can see from the visual, it places the learner in the center of the community. And it basically makes the point that the schooling system is a multi-sectoral system. You know, it is so complex, and you will see besides government departments, NGOs, NPOs, it basically places the school or the child as, you know, fundamentally within the center. And some of the priority areas within the conceptual framework, it deals with infrastructure, it deals with health, it deals with psychosocial support, curriculum support, material support. And I think the point that I wanted to make here was that, again, it's a fairly complex system. So if you're looking at the school, it's more than just teaching and learning, and it's really about care and support, and how do we create an enabling space to maximize you know, care and support. So coming to the Department of Basic Education approach, and I think Carl spoke to some of the issues, that really what we want to do when it comes to CSE and comprehensive sexuality education and the provision of sexual rights and services is about it being rights-based, it's about it being scientifically accurate information, it is about it being contextual, and you know, colleagues have asked Karen about its relevance to the South African context. A lot of the work that we've done is framed within policies, frameworks, and guidelines. We harness the curriculum and the co-curricular space in order to do our work. And of course, it is about it being evidence-based. So I think, Karen, it's alignment to the, you know, to the technical guidance for sexuality education guidelines is important. And what we try and focus on then is sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality and equity. We look at gender diverse minorities, and of course, the whole issue of stigma and discrimination is critically important. So just in terms of the brief that I received for this presentation, basically we wanted to share with you how we engaged around the issues of comprehensive sexuality education and, more importantly, sexual and reproductive health. So I've designed the presentation in two pieces. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about comprehensive sexuality education and then some reflection on the provision of sexual and reproductive health services within the schooling system. Here, what we did initially with regards to comprehensive sexuality education, we reviewed our CAPS, which is the Curriculum Assessment Policy Statement, which is basically the curriculum that is outlined for the entire schooling system. So we did a review of CAPS against the Integrated Technical Guidance of Sexuality Education. We did some very interesting work, and some of you might know the late Dr. Douglas Kirby, who wrote a lot and did a lot of work on comprehensive sexuality education. And he actually came into South Africa and did a review of CAPS against the integrated school health. Obviously, we found a whole lot of gaps, and we looked at what would then be our approach. There were a couple of things that we wanted to do. We wanted to look at content that was directed in terms of comprehensive sexuality education, and we also wanted to develop resources. I think there is a lot of, uncertainty about the capability of our teachers to actually teach sexuality education. No slur on them, but I think it's also about training and education, and how we position ourselves as a country, and I'll allude to that a little bit. But most importantly, I think we wanted to look at how do we create enabling spaces within the school environment. So advocacy work was actually key. Okay, so I think everybody knows this. Karen certainly spoke to it, but just to remind ourselves, comprehensive sexuality education, we don't talk about sex education, we talk about sexuality education. Comprehensive sexuality education embraces teaching and learning, but it's about cognitive learning, it's about emotional learning, it's about physical aspects and social aspects of sexuality, right? We want to be able to do it in a formal way. Karen and I might have a lot of debate about that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it is the teaching and learning system. So how do we harness the formal curriculum space, and how do we harness the co-curriculum space? Sexuality education is really about relationships, right? It's not about just my organs, and it's about the psychological, emotional, mental, and physiological aspects of human beings. It also includes morals, life skills, and values. And I think that's a debate that we can also have, for a long time. What do we want to do with the CSE piece? We want to equip our children with knowledge, skills, and values that will empower them to realize their health and well-being. It's about dignity. It's about their having mutual, respectful, social, and sexual relationships. And very importantly, it's about choices, right? It's also about how do I protect myself throughout my life. And I think in South Africa, with our gender-based violence work, we know that protection is particularly important. So I wanted to kind of give you a quick dose on these slides. And this was really based on the pushback that we had in South Africa when we released the comprehensive sexuality education piece. I think those of us in country would know that we had parents, religious organizations, a whole band of people standing outside the National Department of Basic Education and protesting because they felt that we were selling sex, that we were giving young kids permission to have sex. And I just tried to very quickly capture some of the issues, because I think it is about looking at what comprehensive sexuality education and sexuality education is and is not. The notion that it leads to early sexual initiation. And we know that it actually delays sexual debut because it enables young people to make choices, right? It is enabling them to be more responsible about what they do. We've been told that it deprives young people of their innocence, but we know that children benefit from having access to appropriate, non-judgmental, and developmentally appropriate information, which is what the CSE curriculum does. it goes against our culture or religion. That was a big argument in South Africa, right? That it was against our religious biases. So I think the point that we're trying to make here is that we stress the need to engage with local contexts. We've engaged with traditional and religious communities. CSE actually goes on to address harmful social norms and negative practices as opposed to, enhancing it. Teaching masturbation in grade 4, we got huge comeback for this, right? But there are no masturbation topics in grade 4. Sexual pleasure. This is an important one, and I think I made some comments about this in my later presentation. But the focus of South African curriculum is not on sexual pleasure. Although when it comes to sexuality education and young people engaging with their sexuality, the issue of sexual pleasure is there. But we, for obvious reasons, have taken it out of the curriculum, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Teaching of the UNESCO integrated technical guidance. South Africa believed, or the certain cohort of the protesters believed that we were bringing in an American, curriculum, and they were not happy about it because Americans, foreigners are supposed to have more liberated values when it comes to sex and sexuality. But I think it was the technical guidance certainly helped us strengthen our content. The role of parents, we were not abdicating the role of parents when it comes to sexuality education. In fact, we are saying that parents have a critical role to play. CSE was using pornographic images, and I think Karen spoke to this a little bit. Of course, as the department, we have rigorous protocols and standards in terms of content. There's no way that we can put content out there without it being signed off. So I think, just to keep that in mind. Teaches the types of sex in a curriculum. We're making the point that we don't do sex education, but that we talk about age-appropriate content and the teaching of what it means to be a total person. It's also made the assertion that we'll roll out CSE without teacher training. And of course, many of you would know that since early 2000, the Department of Basic Education has spent a huge amount of resources on teacher education. Okay, so this slide very quickly gives you an overview of how we do comprehensive sexuality education. So what we do is we create an enabling system in the school. So the advocacy piece is very, very important. We make very specific attempts to capacitate the school governing body, the school management team, the district-based support teams, the school-based support teams to create an enabling environment. And we also then work with parents. So you have to have an enabling environment that facilitates the provision of sexuality education. We then use ambassadors to create, again, advocacy champions. We have a set of teaching materials, and we look at how then do we strengthen linkages to sexuality, health and rights services. And I think the point to make here is that we see comprehensive sexuality education as demand creation, right? Because you are teaching in the classroom, the child hears some information in the classroom, and he or she has to have the ability to go outside the classroom and access services. So maybe you're teaching condom use and you say something about a burst condom, and the learner thinks, oopsie, I think I might have a problem. But to have the ability to go outside the classroom and access services. So we see CSE as a demand creation vehicle. How am I doing the time? Okay.
Just fine.
So we do it through the curriculum. This was just to make a point that it's very, very formalized. So it's done through the life orientation subject. It's written into the policy assessment statement, and that this just gives you a sense of the themes that are covered. So it is a very formal process. In fact, there is also an assessment around it, as many of you know. This, Karen, I think is an important piece because, again, Ilona, kind of said, how do we see this app, fitting into the system? And I thought that the co-curricular piece would then be really important. because we look at peer education. We have a process called MTV, a program called MTV Sugar. We have soul buddies, and we have peer-to-peer engagement, and then this becomes a very, very important piece where I think a lot of informal play can happen without too much of a disruption to the system. And of course, we have the Representative Council of Learners, which is a body of young people formalized through the South African Schools Act, and they have a very important piece to play when it comes to social justice issues within the classroom. This is the scripted lesson plans, which is a very, very important piece of the sexuality, the comprehensive sexuality education piece. Because when Dr. Kirby came into South Africa and did the assessment, in fact, I was very fortunate to work with him, and I worked for the department at the time. And with Doug, we did school-to-school visits. So we went into the most remote areas, and we did school-to-school visits to see what was the issue. Besides there being gaps in terms of content, what we found was that educators just couldn't do this stuff, right? I mean, it was about morals, it was about values. How do I teach a young child sitting in my classroom about sex and sexuality? I mean, also, as South Africans, when we think about sex and sexuality, we think about under the covers, in the dark, and you don't talk about it. So one of the big things that we found was that teachers just do not have what it takes in terms of the emotions, the content, etc., etc. I mean, that's a discussion that we can have, again for a long, long time. So the notion was to develop scripted lesson plans, and it says exactly how it's named. The idea was to script content with very deliberate and specific outcomes. So if I want to reach that spot, how do I get there, right? So that's what the scripted lesson plans were about, and it covered a series of topics from grade 4 to grade 12. So what you see here is actually hardcore resources. So we have an educator's guidebook, we have learner workbooks, and they run from grade 4 to grade 12. And Karen, one of the things the department will obviously want to know is the alignment of Loveland to the content here, because alignment then becomes very important because it's about policy, right? So this is the scripted lesson plans. How did we develop it? As I said, we did a review of the curriculum against the technical guidance. I spoke about the key issues with regards to teaching. The scripted lesson plan development, or the scripted lesson plans, is actually a tool for the educator. So it's a resource in which Loveland could be. We have the Amaze sexuality education videos that are developed by UNFPA. We have, different kinds of material. It's about content, but very importantly, it's also about pedagogy. Because one of the things we found is that when you're teaching sexuality education, you need participatory methodology, right? You can't sit there and say, I'm teaching you how to put on a condom theoretically. Because putting on a condom is about developing a competence, right? So it's about using participatory pedagogy to ensure that you achieve your outcome. So that's something else that the scripted lesson plans did. It's scripted for the teacher how to, and that was very important. And I think we spoke about this. It's about being right-based. It's about it being scientifically accurate, age-appropriate, and contextual is critically important. Because, and I think Karen spoke, your tool is designed for 10 to 14 or beyond. But again, it's about having age-appropriate content. So a colleague of mine, I remember, gave this example, and she said they were driving to school one day, and he said, Mom, do I sleep with my cousin? He was 6-year-old. And she's thinking in her mind, my God, what is he asking me? And then she stopped herself and she said, well, a 6-year-old is asking me this question. And she says, yes, of course, you sleep next to your cousin. It was that kind of thing. So it's about age-appropriate, contextual, but as an adult, she had all these other notions going on in her mind. Relevant knowledge, skills, values, about it being evidence-based, The information is graded, so it's about sequential application of knowledge. As you will see, it's classroom-based and focused. What we then did was develop about 80 lesson plans that, spill over from grade 4 to grade 12. And as I said, there's an educator guide and a learner workbook. This was just to give you a quick overview. As you can see, it's sequential. It's done from grade 4 to 6. We're talking about safety of learners, giving them, empowering them, linking them to psychosocial support services. In grade 7 and 9, it's a little bit more intense. It talks about risk reduction. We talk about contraceptive, HIV, gender-based violence. And then 10 to 12, it becomes a little bit more, detailed in terms of content. This is an important piece, Karen, I think, in terms of, one of the things we've kind of dabbled with over the years as the basic education sector is to use digital media. And I think this, falls very nicely here. COVID, of course, caught us off guard, but it also showed us that we could really use the digital space very effectively. And I think a lot of the work and the momentum sped up during COVID and post-COVID when it came to, this issue. But having said that, we have converted the CSE material into radio lessons in different languages. So in the most deep rural of KZN, you can have a community radio station in the local language talking about CSE. We have a TV series called Breaking the Silence, using the notion of a popular personality figure, engaging teachers and young people on sexuality education issues, the use of digital platforms, what we call jamborees is a market square event, oh my word, and then community-based activities, right? And I'm going to really speed it up. Okay, I'm not going to even talk about this because I want to get to the important part. Oops, what did I do?
Can you go back?
Was it me? Okay, I'm not going to even talk about that. Okay, yes. So this is an important part of the, the thing. And comprehensive sexuality education, I think I've given you more than enough, and it's, an open resource where you can look at that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the provision of sexual and reproductive health services in schools. So we have amazing legislation. We have what we call the Integrated School Health Program. It's a policy. It makes provision for health services within schools. And it basically, it appeals to the fact that children spend formative years in school. We have this huge catchment of 40 million young people that we can, reach. So it's an ideal opportunity for health education. It's very systemic. And I think what it does is that it places the provision of sexual health and reproductive services, within the school system. What it does talk about in terms of sexual and reproductive health was largely about HIV and dual provision and the provision of HIV testing. So I think some of these aspects that I put in red is deliberately because it was trying to make the point. So I wanted to show you that we've done a huge amount of work when it comes to the provision of sexual and reproductive health and rights services. We have guidelines where we involve parents. But I think the point that, and maybe I need to say that when I'm talking about these slides, I'm taking off my hat that I represent the department because I think these are also some of the issues I feel very personally about. Is that it makes the point of saying that sexual and reproductive health services will be provided if required. And that's a problem, right? It also says that, okay, it makes a point that it's a sensitive matter and that parents must be informed. But we know that if a youngster wants to engage in a sexual relationship, 90% out of 100, the source of information is not going to be the parent. And that's what the school system is saying. Then, in terms of the literature review, we did a literature review in 2018. It agreed that models do exist, but it deferred the provision of sexual and reproductive health services to a private provider. And that's, again, a problem, because how many of our youngsters have the ability to access it privately? School-based services in terms of condom provision and contraceptive access is largely controversial. It still remains controversial in South Africa. There was a report about where learners and educators and parents were consulted. It was a formal project that was done in 2019. And I think the last two bullets here were particularly important, is that young people were saying that parents are often not the appropriate source, because it's about them being negative, it's about them being authoritarian, and it's always associated with social and cultural norms and taboos. And it actually made the point that social media, mobile platforms were preferred by young people. So Karen, that's one for you. Thank you. Okay, so very quickly, 2 slides when I've done it.
Yes.
I think I went the wrong way, did I? Yes. The point I wanted to make here is that if you look at the International Conference on Population and Development and the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, they define reproductive health as a state of complete social, mental, and social well-being. It's not merely about disease or infirmity. And that's what we did in South Africa, right? We equated sexual and reproductive health to HIV and being positive. But it's saying here that it's not about that. People are able to have satisfying and safe sex lives with capability of freedom of choice. It also made a point that when sexual and reproductive health are recognized and you give access to age-appropriate information, young people are able to deal with the practice and outcomes of sex in a responsible and a respectful way with satisfying relationships of mutual concern. And I wanted to make that point because GBV in our country is awful, right? We know most of the time it's about power and it's about coercion. So think about it, in that way. So my last slide. What are the challenges? That issues related to sex and sexuality is framed within morality. It's in the dark and it's under the covers. And the very critical point is that young people are not seen as sexual beings. In fact, we made a deliberate choice in the CSE material to remove sex for pleasure. In fact, we are silent about it, and the broader social issues when it comes to sexual diversity. We know one of the safest sex practices is to masturbate. South Africa will never teach a young person how to masturbate because it's about sex for pleasure, right? Educators are not formally trained to teach CSE at a scale that is needed. We know that the content is constantly evolving. So I think Loveland has the capability to, then stay relevant. We need a brand that fits young people and a brand that appeals. And again, as the department, we failed hopelessly when it comes to that, right? Because we don't have this exciting brand because, again, it's about issues of morality. We need to ensure that there's consistent, pervasive messaging across all our platforms. We don't have that. And one of the last things that perhaps we need to keep in mind is some of you might know the work of Professor Haley McEwen from the WITS, I think it's the Gender and Diversity Study, where we know that there's an organized counter movement that is pro-family and anti-progressive when it comes to the opposition of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I think that is one of the things that we are facing. And I think my closing comment, to speak to Karen and what she's trying to do, is that we certainly need to create alternate, safe spaces, and certainly the app does that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow. I see there's a lot been going on in South Africa lately.
Yes.
In this field. I mean, I'm impressed to hear all of this. And of course, we are very much interested to talk to you how our app could not compete against what you're doing, but complement what you're doing, supporting what you're doing. I think that's also our goal. It's not about competing against existing solutions, it's complementing. So thank you very much for your time, for being here. And yeah, let's move on. We were still kind of doing fine with time, very relaxed. Yeah, we would like to move on.